I still remember the smell of pine that used to drift across my father's land every morning. It was 20 acres of rolling green hills and dense trees, a quiet piece of heaven far from the noise of the city. I inherited it after he passed away, and even though life kept me busy, I always told myself I'd return one day and make it my forever home. But life has a way of twisting your plans. My wife's long battle with cancer broke me. When she died, I couldn't bear to stay in the same place anymore. Every corner of the city reminded me of her laugh, her perfume, her absence. So I packed my things, locked the gate to my land, and went backpacking across Asia just to breathe again. I told myself it would be for a few months, maybe a year at most. Almost 2 years later, I came back. I had no grand expectations, just peace, familiarity, and the comfort of walking barefoot on the soil my father and I once planted apple trees on. As I drove down the old county road toward Lakewood Hills, I noticed small changes, new street signs, trimmed grass, a few stores that hadn't been there before. But when I turned onto the road leading to my property, my stomach tightened. The dirt road I remembered was gone. It was newly paved, smooth and shiny. Fresh streetlights lined the path like something out of a suburban dream. That didn't make sense. My property was rural, isolated. There shouldn't have been any development this far out. I slowed down as I reached the bend that should have opened up to my field. Instead, I froze. My heart dropped like a stone. In front of me stood rows upon rows of brand new houses, cookie-cutter homes, all painted beige or white, lined perfectly symmetrical streets. There were mailboxes, driveways, trimmed lawns, and children riding bikes. It looked like a neighborhood that had been there for years. But I knew every inch of this land. This was my property. Every house stood where my father's forest once was. I parked my truck and got out, shaking my head in disbelief. Maybe I was lost. Maybe I'd taken the wrong road. But as I walked toward a tall metal sign at the entrance, my blood ran cold. It read, "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates, managed by Lakewood HOA." HOA? What HOA? This wasn't real. I felt a wave of confusion mixed with panic as I walked further in. The air smelled like fresh paint and asphalt, not pine and soil. Where was my barn? Where was the old oak tree my dad carved our initials into? Every landmark was gone. "Excuse me, sir," a sharp voice called out. I turned to see a woman in her late 40s power walking toward me. She wore a white blazer, sunglasses, and carried a clipboard like it was a sword. Her hair was perfectly styled, too perfect for someone just walking around a construction zone. "Yes," I said, still disoriented. "You can't be here," she said curtly. "This is a private community. Residents only." I blinked at her. "Private community? Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake. This land, this whole area belongs to me." Her lips twitched into a condescending smile. "Oh, really? And who might you be?" "My name's James Carter. My father owned this property before me. Carter Farm. This was our land." Her fake smile didn't fade. "I'm afraid that's impossible. This land was purchased for development 3 years ago. It's part of Lakewood Township now. I'm Karen Montgomery, president of the Lakewood HOA and the development board for Willow Creek Estates. So if you don't mind, I'll have to ask you to leave." I stared at her, words caught in my throat. "Purchased? From who?" "Because I didn't sell it. I was out of the country, but I paid my taxes. I have the title, the deed, everything." Karen sighed, clearly irritated. "Sir, if you abandoned your property and didn't respond to official notices, the city had every right to reclaim and rezone it. That's what happens when landowners disappear for years." "Reclaim?" I repeated, disbelief turning into anger. "I didn't abandon anything. I've got the receipts, the payments, the paperwork to prove it." "Well, then you can take that up with the county clerk," she said dismissively. "In the meantime, you're trespassing on private HOA property. If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." She turned and pointed at a newly installed "No Trespassing" sign nailed into what used to be my father's favorite oak tree. I felt a lump form in my throat, not just from the audacity of it, but from the sheer disrespect. You destroyed everything, I muttered. Karen raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? I looked around at the cookie-cutter houses again. There used to be a forest here. My dad planted those trees with his own hands. There was a barn over there, a pond beyond that ridge, and you bulldozed it all to make this soulless suburbia. Her expression hardened. Progress always upsets someone. Now please leave before I make a call. That was the last straw. I turned and walked back to my truck before I said something I'd regret. But as I drove away, fury burned in my chest. They thought they could erase my family's legacy, build 85 houses on stolen land, and hide behind their precious HOA. But what Karen didn't know was that I'd kept every single document locked safely away before I left: deeds, tax records, proof of ownership. My father taught me to keep backups of everything. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was shaking, not with fear, but with resolve. I stopped at a small diner, ordered black coffee, and pulled out my phone. The first number I dialed was my father's old lawyer, Daniel Reeves, a man who'd handled every legal matter for us since I was a kid. Daniel, I said when he picked up, you're not going to believe what happened. He listened quietly as I explained everything. When I finished, there was a long silence before he spoke. James, he said, finally, bring every document you have to my office tomorrow morning. If what you're saying is true, someone forged paperwork and illegally developed your property. And if that's the case, they stole from the wrong man. I finished. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the sight of those identical houses over and over again. My father's land, our heritage, had been taken, paved, sold, and claimed by strangers. But deep down, I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. As the clock struck midnight, I made myself a promise. I was going to expose Karen Montgomery, tear down her empire brick by brick, and take back what was rightfully mine. And when I did, she would learn what it truly meant to mess with a man who had nothing left to lose. I woke up the next morning with the taste of cold iron in my mouth and a single idea lodged behind my teeth. Find out exactly who had the courage to steal my father's land and then make them pay. I made the drive into town through rain that blurred the edges of everything, like the world itself was still trying to make sense of what had been done. Daniel Reeves met me at his office with the slow, grave look of a man who had handled ugly things before and knew how to keep his cool. He spread my old deed and tax receipts across his desk like a surgeon laying out instruments and ran a finger along the stamped county records. This is clean, he said. No cloud on the title. Whoever filed that transfer forged your signature or bribed someone at the clerk's office. My hands shook. Then let's find out who. Daniel smiled once, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who liked puzzles. He set me to work with a list. First step, get copies of every document that had changed hands over the last 3 years. The building permits, the zoning changes, the emails to the county office, the bank records tied to the development company. He told me not to tell anyone except him and one trusted investigator. He recommended a wiry former reporter named Maria, who lived on strong coffee, and an instinct for when people lied. We started small. Maria sat at the county records terminal with her laptop like a hawk and dug through scan files. After a morning of clicking and cross-referencing, she found the first red flag, a transfer recorded 6 months after I left with signatures that didn't match mine. She printed the scanned signature and held it next to one of my father's old checks. The loops were wrong, the pressure inconsistent. A forgery. Nice try, Karen, I said under my breath, though we had no proof yet that Karen's hand touched it. But the paper trail pointed somewhere close to the Lakewood HOA, the development committee, a shell company called Willow Ridge Development. Names that kept circling back to Karen in meetings and HOA minutes. We needed more than paper. We needed someone who worked on the inside to talk. So I put on a plain jacket and went back to Willow Creek under a different pretense. This time I told people I was an investor from the city considering a second purchase. I smiled when contractors showed me blueprints and feigned ignorance while asking about permits. People let their guard down when they thought you were money. One afternoon, I struck gold. I cornered a foreman named Luis while he took a smoke break by a half-built porch. He was a man who smelled like sawdust and hard work and didn't like to get pulled into HOA politics. I bought him a beer and listened. He talked too much once he thought I was a prospective buyer. They pushed us to finish fast, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Said we be paid in full on completion. Told us not to worry about paperwork. Karen handled it. She brought the plan signed and said the city would approve. We all trusted her. Hell, she bought lunch for the crew and said it was a favor to the community. Did anyone ever ask to see deeds? I asked casually. Luis laughed, then sobered. No, papers weren't our job, but the clerk who signed off on paving, we heard she got a bonus. Weird thing. People get bonuses when they do favors for powerful folks. That was the seam to pull. Maria worked her contacts, and within 2 weeks, the county clerk who'd rubber-stamped a suspicious rezoning quietly transferred to another department and then took early retirement. People talk when they think there's smoke. One of the clerk's assistants texted Maria a blurry photo of an envelope marked with Willow Ridge Development and an amount in cash. The assistant swore she didn't want trouble, but she wanted the truth out. Armed with that, Daniel filed motions for a forensic handwriting analysis and subpoenas for all communications between the HOA and township officials. The subpoenas came down like thunder. I watched Karen's composure during those first waves of legal pressure. Outwardly, she was calm, the kind of serene fury that wore expensive perfume and never raised her voice. But I started to notice slips, little tells that made my stomach do flips. She avoided eye contact with certain homeowners at meetings, and her assistant started taking calls outside the room. The more we uncovered, the more it became clear this wasn't a lone act of ambition. This was an orchestrated scheme. Karen had used the HOA's credibility to recruit investors and buyers, then cut legal corners and grease the right palms at the county offices to keep the papers moving. People who moved and thought they were buying a home. They were buying into a lie. I never wanted innocent families to suffer. That remained my compass. So, while Daniel pursued the legal angles Maria and I pursued perceptions, we needed the community to understand the truth. I arranged for a discreet meeting with 2 homeowners who had been furious when they first learned. They were decent folks who'd already expressed doubts after hearing rumors. They agreed to help. The stage we set was simple. We arranged a town hall where Karen would present a plaque ceremony and talk about Willow Creek's future. I attended with a quiet confidence, front row this time with a thick folder of copies of county records. Instead of a show of force, I used strategy. I let Karen talk. She painted herself as a visionary, then passed around applause like a magician passing cards. When she finished, I stood up and asked to speak. Before you hand out awards, Karen, I said, would you mind explaining why so many of us never saw any proper transfer documents? And why every county notice about unpaid liens ended up in your office? Silence. Then a ripple of uncertainty. Karen's mask cracked for half a second, then she smiled, too big, and turned the situation like a gladiator spinning on her heel. This man is causing a scene, she said. We did everything by the book. At that moment, I opened my folder and handed a copy of the questionable transfer to the homeowner nearest me. Cameras that had been casually recording whipped to life. Someone uploaded a shaky handheld video to social media within minutes, and the clip began to ripple across town. Once people saw the paperwork and compared signatures, they began to ask questions. The homeowners who had already suspected anything started whispering, and their whisper became a murmur, which became a chorus. Karen started to sputter, and her carefully controlled narrative splintered. It was then Maria played her ace, a recorded conversation from months earlier, a clip we'd obtained from a contractor who'd been careless with his phone during a private celebration where Karen was overheard saying she'd take care of the county clerk and that the land would be hers. The audio hit like a blow. People looked at her the way they looked at a stranger on their porch who'd stolen their wallet. I felt an odd mixture of vindication and sorrow. The families looked at me like I'd thrown them into a storm. Their homes were at risk, and some had mortgages and teenage children and jobs that couldn't just be picked up and moved. I didn't rub it in. I knew what justice should look like: the perpetrators punished and the victims made whole. Within days, the county froze new sales stop permits and launched a criminal inquiry. Karen began to fight back through lawyers sending cease and desist letters and trying to paint me as a disgruntled ex-owner who'd abandoned his property. It was petty and expected. Meanwhile, the media smelled a scandal and started asking questions. Headlines about corrupt HOAs and greedy developers made the front page of the local paper, and TV vans rolled up to Willow Creek with lights and microphones like vultures. One night, as I sat at Daniel's kitchen table with a mug of tea and a stack of subpoenas between us, I realized the trap was closing. But traps have teeth, and the people who set them tend to fight harder than you expect. Karen wasn't going quietly, and neither would the network of people who profited from the houses she'd sold. The difference now was the law was on our side, and the town had started to wake up. I lay awake that night plotting the next moves not out of spite, but out of a deep sense of duty to my father's memory and to the families who'd been deceived. The courtroom was coming, but first we had to make sure the truth was so plain the judge couldn't ignore it. We had the papers, the recordings, the witnesses, and now we had the town's attention. If I'd thought anger before had been a hot coal in my hand, this was an inferno. And as I watched Karen on the evening news, she looked smaller behind the glossy footage, the perfect suit, and the rehearsed smile. For the first time since I returned, she looked vulnerable. The trap was sprung, but the final act had yet to play out, and I knew that when the curtain rose in court, it would be a reckoning that neither she nor anyone who helped her would forget. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of place where time itself seemed to stand still waiting to see which side of justice would tip the scales. The day the trial began, Willow Creek's future hung in the air like a storm cloud. Every bench was packed homeowners on one side, journalists with cameras on the other, and in the front row, Karen Montgomery sat perfectly still, her pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights like armor. She still wore that same confident smirk, the one she had used to brush me off when I first returned, but I could see the tension in her jaw now. She was unraveling, and she knew it. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the judge entered, a woman named Judith Carter, no relation to me, though. I almost wished she were. She had the kind of voice that could cut through steel, and a stare that made even lawyers choose their words carefully. Daniel sat beside me, flipping through the files one last time as the prosecutor outlined the charges: forgery, fraud, conspiracy to commit land theft, and obstruction of justice. Karen's defense lawyer tried to object to the very wording of it all, claiming the case was built on misunderstandings, but the judge waved him off with a single raised hand. Then it began. Daniel took the floor. First, his voice calm, deliberate, never rising, but every word hitting like a hammer. He walked the jury through every step of Karen's scam, from the falsified deed to the backdoor payments at the zoning office. He projected the documents onto a large screen showing my real signature beside the forgery. Even from my seat, I could see the differences clear as daylight. The jury leaned forward. They saw it too. Then came the financial records linking the HOA's development funds to the shell company Karen created. She hadn't just built houses on stolen land. She'd pocketed millions in kickbacks from investors who thought they were paying for legal permits. When it was my turn to take the stand, my palms were sweating, but my voice held steady. I told the court about my father, the land, the years I spent abroad, and the shock of returning to find a neighborhood standing where his orchard once grew. I kept my tone calm, though my heart burned inside me. This land wasn't abandoned, I said. It was stolen, and every inch of it carries my father's sweat and memories. The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratching of pens. I saw some of the jurors exchange glances. Karen's lawyer tried to shake me during cross-examination, accusing me of fabricating documents to extort money from the development company, but Daniel objected before he could finish the sentence, and the judge sustained it. The lawyer backed down, his face red. Then came Maria's turn. She testified about the recordings, the meetings, the clerk who'd received cash payments, and the emails we uncovered through subpoena. She spoke like a journalist, used to cutting through lies, short, precise, factual. When the prosecutor played the audio recording of Karen's voice bragging that no one will ever know, that was the breaking point. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Karen looked down at the table, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The defense tried one last desperate tactic, arguing that Karen had been misled by her assistant, that she never knew the documents were forged. But the evidence told another story. Her digital signature appeared on every fraudulent approval. Bank records traced directly to her personal account. Every lie she built her empire on started to collapse one by one. By the end of the second week, even the reporters had stopped asking for quotes. The story told itself. HOA president builds homes on stolen land, screamed one headline. Community in shock AS fraud case unfolds, said another. Every evening news channel carried footage of Karen leaving court with her designer sunglasses hiding tear-streaked eyes. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. The jury deliberated only 4 hours. I sat there barely breathing as the foreman stood and read the words that would end it all. We find the defendant, Karen Montgomery, guilty on all counts. The words hit the room like thunder. Karen slumped in her chair, eyes wide as if she still couldn't believe it. The judge's gavel came down once sharp and final. She sentenced Karen to 10 years in prison for fraud and forgery plus restitution for every family she had defrauded. The county seized all remaining HOA assets and froze her accounts pending liquidation to pay damages. The homeowners, many of whom had once doubted me, came forward afterward to shake my hand. Some apologized for calling me a liar. Others thanked me for saving them from financial ruin. The city promised to buy out the affected homes using the recovered funds and insurance settlements. It wouldn't erase what happened, but at least no family would lose everything. When Karen was escorted out in handcuffs, she stopped at the door and looked back at me. For a moment, the courtroom noise faded, and it was just the two of us across the gulf of everything she destroyed. "You destroyed me," she hissed. "No," I said quietly. "You destroyed yourself when you built your fortune on someone else's grave." She turned away then, and the officers led her through the doors. That was the last time I saw her. Months later, Willow Creek was almost empty. The half-finished houses were demolished, the lots cleared, and the land restored to county ownership until my title was fully reinstated. The county gave me back legal possession with apologies and a statement of recognition for exposing corruption that could have cost taxpayers millions. The first morning I walked back onto the open field, it didn't look like it used to. The trees were gone, the soil raw and wounded, but it was mine again. I spent days planting new saplings in straight lines where my father once planted his orchard. Each one felt like an apology whispered into the earth. Sometimes at dusk, I'd see the faint remains of the old driveways that once led to those identical houses, and I'd remember the voices of children riding their bikes on stolen land. I didn't hate them. They'd been pawns like everyone else. But I couldn't help the bittersweet satisfaction that justice had been served. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Daniel stopped by with a stack of papers, the final closing of the case. "It's done," he said simply. "You're the sole legal owner again. They can't touch you now." I smiled and looked out over the fields. They never will again. As he left, I stayed by the edge of the property where my father's old oak used to stand. The one Karen had nailed her sign into. The county had cut it down during cleanup, but I planted a new sapling there, small and fragile but stubborn like me. I knelt, brushed the soil over its roots, and whispered, "We're home, Dad." The wind blew softly through the fresh leaves. And in that quiet moment, after 2 years of running, months of fighting, and one long war in court, I felt peace for the first time in forever. The land was mine, the legacy restored, and the woman who tried to steal it all would spend the next decade remembering the day she picked the wrong man to cross. Because some things money can't buy: honor, truth, and the kind of revenge that comes wrapped in justice.